stranger. A word to those reading this. This is a true story. It really did happen. I changed the names of those involved because that doesn't matter. What matters is you read this and pick up the warning signs of any new friends you might meet. And get out. And get out of the way before things get out of hand. I was naive and also very, very lucky. So listen closely to make sure you never even get close to having something like this happen to you. I was in a relationship for 3.5 years in my mid-20s, and it ended abruptly and unpleasantly. I was left with a really bitter taste in my mouth. Even though I had a good job at the time in a college town working for the university, and there were tons of people around, I felt very alone and very isolated. A lot of things reminded me of Megan in the faculty side of town, so I decided to do something I thought I would never want to do again, and I started to drift towards the undergraduate side of town, looking for maybe someone to date before the age gap got too weird, or if nothing else, a change of scenery, be someplace where I wasn't reminded of her and the stuff that we used to do. It was a mistake to return to these loud, sweaty, smelly places. I was definitely used to finer food and drink and hearing people talk instead of listening to LMFAO's shots blasting in my ear every hour on the hour. But I was definitely drunk and watching something on the bar's only TV in kind of a disassociated blur, while the rest of the bar was alight with dancing, closely huddled cliques of undergrads. I sat sad and alone at the bar, close to the dispensers of the Forget Megan juice. Two strangers sat down next to me. They looked like pretty average 25-year-old guys, and they were talking about something. I wasn't really paying close attention to them until they mentioned a chemical compound that was relatively obscure, but I was very familiar with. They casually mentioned a substance called a TATP. Now, there are 3 ways someone hearing that can react. They can brush it off as they do not know what it is or what it does. They may know what it is and react in horror, or they may know what it is and react in curiosity. For those of you who don't know what this is, it is a non-nitrogen-based high explosive that is insanely easy to make and popular with terrorists. The FBI will tell you that the shoe bomber, the London Underground bombers, and later ISIS bombers would use this explosive to wreak havoc at airports and concert venues. The other thing is that it's extremely unstable. Dropping a feather on a pile of TATP crystals can set it off. The fact that it is a non-nitrogen-based explosive also helps terrorists evade certain explosive detectors. Well, at least it did back then. I knew what it was because my grade school chemistry teacher, long before the age of terrorism, showed our class what it could do. That, and I was working for the university on a project that tracked terrorism now, and as I previously mentioned, it was popular with the Islamists at the time. I personally was interested in making it myself since I grew up in the country, and making things go boom for the 4th of July or just for fun was still something I wanted to do. Perhaps even more now because I was single again and had little else to do, and something dangerous like that had a semi-self-destructive appeal. So I heard this guy at the bar casually mention it, and then other explosives piqued my interest, my curiosity, and then my alarm bells. When his friend left, I engaged the other stranger in conversation about explosives and other chemicals in general. At first he was very standoff, at one point asking me if I was a cop. I should have just dropped it then and there. Talking about explosives and being paranoid are pretty big red flags, but I was drunk and I thought it would be nice to try to make a new friend who, at least I thought, shared an academic interest in these topics. So I pursued it. Eventually the dude, his name was David, opened up a bit and we chatted at length about a variety of subjects. One of those subjects included the recent passing of his mother and his acquisition of a large inheritance. I told him about my recent breakup, and I kind of proposed that we hang out again and that I would introduce him to some of my local friends who were interested in discussing similar things. He acknowledged that he did not have a very large friend base, so he said he would be down. But he had to leave for the night to try to take care of some roommate issues, and by roommate he meant the person he was talking to earlier who left. This was around 2013 or 2014, and calling people on the phone and actually talking to them was still a thing. So I made a few calls, and before I knew it, I had a pretty solid friend group ready to hang out in the town's nightlife. David, although a little standoffish at first, seemed to integrate well enough with this group, whether we were playing board games at my place with my roommates, or out at one of the bars just having a few beers or playing a pub quiz. David had more or less at that point become one of the boys. He was usually quiet unless the conversation steered towards bombs, guns, drugs, or the government, which I guess because those topics were so salient and normalized at my job, they didn't really stand out to me as red flags, and this particular friend group had no serious hang-ups on these topics. The first hint of his outright oddness was his constant praise of then a little-known drug called modafinil, which he claimed enhanced his brain power. Apparently it was something tech bros were into. He would also say something derogatory towards someone who brought up sports or popular entertainment. Everything other than, say, The Dark Knight and the Joker, which was something he raved about. And he also mentioned a distinct mistrust of women, which again, this was 2013, and those warning signs were not nearly as glaring as they would be in, say, 2020. I remember now, in fact, that he referred to himself as an incel in one time, and I had no idea what the hell that was. So I ignored it and brushed it off. I chalked up a lot of what he said in my own burning wound of Megan, and just ignored it. That and everyone in the friend group who had all recently stung from relationship issues, and no one really had any reason to question each other's hurt in this regard. It wasn't a positive environment looking back on it, I realize this now, but sometimes misery loves company. So a lot of this oddness at the time definitely flew under our radars. It didn't get really weird until the night he offered to drive one of my friends, Gary, back to his home 2 towns over. Gary was not as experienced of a drinker as the rest of us and was considerably smaller than us, and I think the shots we did on our way out were just way too much for him to handle. He was pretty out of it and definitely couldn't drive. None of us had a place big enough where he could stay and sleep it off, so getting him home was really the only option. David, who was fairly sober still, offered us all a ride home, which we enthusiastically took him up on. I remember walking to his car with Gary slung over my shoulder and James's shoulder, following David's lead when James called out David for not drinking as much as we did. James was pretty screwed up on lager and Irish whiskey, and sometimes he would just be straight up insulting. David replied, saying nonchalantly that he was on probation, and he had to meet with his probation officer in the morning, and he didn't want to smell like he was drinking. That was quite surprising given what we had known of David so far. We probably hung out about 4 times now, and this was somehow never once came up before. So I asked him what he was on probation for, and I didn't get a quick answer because several new questions popped up. He clicked a key fob and revealed his personal vehicle to us in the parking lot. He drove a gold minivan outfitted with a winch and police car-like protective ramming cages, which David said he custom-built and fitted to the front and rear of his van himself. Besides the cages, his windows were heavily tinted, and he had multiple GADSED flag bumper stickers stuck to the rear, front, and sides of his vehicle. He initiated the motorized doors on the passenger bay, and we saw that he was carrying multiple AR-15 assault rifles loaded and ready in the back of his van. The bumper stickers were a red flag. The cages were a red flag. The AR-15s were a screaming red flag. I was very much into the sensible gun owner phase of my life when I indeed had myself an AR-15. I definitely didn't carry multiple around in my van when I went to bars, though. Also, I did not approve of the ideologies on display on his vehicle at the time, nor now, that associate with that particular bumper sticker. Though I had my first real misgivings about David, James and Gary were very impressed with his collection of weapons. I didn't say much about the rest of the night, and I was the first one to be dropped off, so I didn't have much time to say anything at all. I was definitely left with scratching my head for most of the rest of the evening, and I let a few days pass before I thought about talking to David, not only about his ideological beliefs, but also why he was on probation and why he drove around with an illegal tint, tons of weapons, and was up on some kind of mystery pharmaceutical all the time. I decided to probe this at Gary's birthday party, which we set up days earlier. We were going to meet up at the local pub that had a quiz night and see if our combined big brains could win some free beer for the trouble. While James and Gary showed up on time and did some birthday shots, David did not show up until the fourth round of 7 of the pub quiz. He also brought his roommate, a gentleman by the name of Earl, and while Earl barely said anything and looked like he was entirely exhausted and worn out, David, by contrast, was animated, lively, social, and confident, especially confident in his answers in the quiz, which more often than not were actually completely correct. He also revealed that he was happy to pay for all of the night's festivities, as he claimed to have made tens of millions of dollars in Bitcoin over the past few days by investing his inheritance. All of this fantastic news and, of course, the entire setting, I was definitely waiting for the right time to start asking questions about the other night. But then he volunteered another whopper of a big, big red flag when he got up mid-round to go to the bathroom and came back having to claim to have just smoked meth that he bought off the deep web. Gary and James threw their heads back and laughed it off as a joke. I was sitting closer to him than they were, and the direction of the air in the pub was wafting towards me. I believed him, but before I could wrap my head around that he also volunteered that he was finishing off paying off the fine of his plea out, I finally got a word in and asked what exactly he was playing out for. He boldly and proudly announced to the group that he was the state's only convicted cyber terrorist, and then went into detail about the apps that he wrote to lock and unlock the university facility doors at will, as well as his attempt to hack professors' calendars and online assignments. Apparently, he had used the app to lock a professor in a tech lab for hours so that a test was canceled for the entire class because he couldn't make it that day. It was at this point I knew I was in real trouble. David and his extreme claims were definitely driving a wedge between me and him, but also between me, Gary, and James. Gary and James were towny friends I met years ago, and as I said, I was somewhat neglectful of our friendship during the Megan years, but it was their undying praise for David's antisocial and far-right expressions that made me realize that not only were David and I likely enemies, in fact, but perhaps I was also now enemies with Gary and James as well. This was definitely the time before smartphones, so I couldn't immediately verify if his criminal claims were true, but as the night wore on, and not only did he drink more, but also disappear to the bathroom a couple more times, I was convinced that he wasn't lying about the meth, even if his teeth were straight and pearly. Among the most memorable claims that he made that evening, David divulged that he was building a bunker under his deceased mother's home in Maryland, and that his roommate was helping him use some kind of design software to help build it. Earl then chimed in for the first time the whole night, saying that David was a great guy and that he was paying for his chemotherapy. Piercing through the din of chatter over the pub quiz questions, David tilted his head back towards the ceiling and shouted out, "Ball cancer!" like he was announcing that he got a bingo. James, Gary, and I looked at Earl with concerned glances while David just kept laughing uncontrollably in his seat with his head tilted back. With each passing round of pub quiz, the things David told us just kept escalating. Eventually, he said he was moving some light machine guns back to his Maryland home tomorrow, and we could see them in the back of his van later. When we finished pub quiz and actually won 2 rounds outright, earning us some beer money, David did actually pay the $200 birthday tab. I was really uncertain about what was going on. David was definitely acting like some kind of sociopath, whether he was telling the truth or not. I didn't know if he was otherwise mentally ill and these lies were actually hard-held delusions, or if they weren't lies and he was actually a potential threat to himself and others. And by others, I mean a threat to hundreds or thousands of people, as he casually discussed rigging up his bunker with exotic anti-government defenses, including chemical weapons that could not only wipe out advancing SWAT teams, but potentially his entire neighborhood. I was walking a real tightrope between insanity and real danger. I also felt responsible, not only for introducing him to my friend group and giving him a friend group that praised him for all this stuff, but also I knew that I had taken in myself. I felt sorry for him early on when he said he was kind of alone and that he had lost his mother recently. I wanted to do something for him, and like I said earlier, I could relate to loss. But my brain was screaming now, isn't this exactly what sociopaths and psychopaths do? Isn't this how they make you feel? I was also honestly intrigued. I didn't know where all of this was going to lead. It wasn't the first time in my life I had been around dangerous people or placed in bizarre situations, and I felt like I had to follow this rabbit hole down just a little further. I did not yet know if his mother actually was dead, if he had made billions on Bitcoin, or if he was the state's only convicted cyber terrorist, but at the end of the night, I can assert he definitely had machine guns. Whether they were fixed to be semi-automatic or they were in fact fully automatic and not legal, I do not know at that time. But he definitely had something resembling an M249 squad automatic weapon in the back of his van that night. While I was deciding what to do, I stopped talking to David for about a week. I took a week off from all of my friends, Gary and James included. I was stymied on what to do, what to believe, and then the weird texts started to come in. As I said before, this happened back in like 2013 or 2014, and I don't recall the exact texts that were sent, but the gist of these texts went something like this. David was boasting about being able to keep people in check, specifically his roommate Earl. The notion that Earl, who apparently was seriously ill with testicular cancer, and David's payment of his chemotherapy was a form of coercion, is heinous enough. But what got even more disturbing was an exchange of texts in which I expressed my utter disdain for David's activities and how he was coercing Earl. And then in reply, in no uncertain terms, David claimed to be the reason, the cause behind Earl's illness, behind Earl's testicular cancer. He described to me as secretly exposing him to a radioactive gamma source, which he claimed he derived from a smoke detector using a similar method to David Hahn, the radioactive Boy Scout. While my understanding of that process is imperfect, I knew it was not impossible to do this. What is unlikely is for Earl to have developed testicular cancer from the exposure, but David was adamant about it, absolutely adamant. I told him that he was sick. He was sick for believing it, for trying it, or sick for lying about this, and sick for holding treatment over somebody's head like this. Then he went off on a tangent about being able to get live bullet ants from the dark web, and then threatened to place them in my car, and then being able to remotely lock me inside while the ants swarmed and stung me. Bullet ants are notorious for being one of the most venomous and painful insect stings in the world, and he was also making note of the fact that they were present in South American rituals where people would get stung by them, because he knew that I was born in that region. Terrified and knowing the situation was beyond hope for his mental illness, but also so borderline unbelievable that I was worried the authorities would never believe anything I was saying, that's when I just decided to stop talking to him altogether. I blocked him on my phone and on Facebook, everywhere. After a couple of days, I decided to talk to James and Gary. I had to get them on the same page and let them know that David was really, really unwell and very dangerous. I was shocked and relieved to hear from both of them that David was moving or had already moved permanently out of town and back to Maryland to work on his bunker. I warned them about him and showed them the texts. I was also warned my roommates and other friends who had incidental contact with him, and I apologized for bringing David so close to them. One time, after working late, I thought I saw the gold van with the ram cages zip out of a nearby parking lot across the street, but I couldn't be sure because I only caught a glimpse of it in the sunfall. Besides the occasional fear of some ham-fisted attempt at blackmail, bullet ants in my car, or suddenly developing testicular cancer, I eventually more or less forgot about David by the time 2019 rolled around. But he became national news in 2019, convicted of involuntary manslaughter of his roommate during the construction of his bunker under his deceased mother's home in Maryland. James, Gary, and select others were, quote, not terribly surprised, but I was shocked and saddened. We were all so close to a very sick puppy who wouldn't bat an eye to put us in a situation where we could take the fall for him, get hurt, or worse, maybe even going so far as to outright killing us. While I do feel responsible and bad for bringing him into my social circle and keeping his head above water in my town, I don't think I had enough to bring this to the authorities, especially since he was already on serious probation and I was apparently doing everything, quite openly in fact, that should have gotten you caught for violating that probation. Either way, my heart goes out to his victim and his loved ones. David, let's never meet again.